So now we have our flaw working so that when we run our game, our player object ends up here on the bottom of the stage. And our player object is this boring rectangle. So the next video here, we're going to show how to make a more animated player. So first let me show you what a more animated player looks like. So here I have this girl object. She's in her own file here. I've created her as a movie clip. And let's look at her. So I'm going to double click on her over here in the library. I know that I'm looking at the girl object because I can see it up here in the top left hand corner. And I've created some layers here. So there's an actions layer, a labels layer, the layer for the girl, the layer for her left leg because her left leg is animated. So see the tween here on this layer. A layer for her right leg, and a layer for her arm because her arm is animated separate also. On the actions layer in that first frame, I have an action of stop, so that when my girl is added to my stage, she'll stay here on frame 1 until I say go to and play another frame. The frame that I'll say to go to and play is the wave frame. I've named this frame on my labels layer. So if I go over to the properties in my labels layer, I can see that I've labeled this frame wave, so that when I tell my code to go to and play wave, it'll go to frame 2 and it'll play this wave animation. Now notice I have some more actions on my actions layer at the end of that animation that tells it to go to and stop on frame 1. So that tells it to go back to frame 1 and wait there until I tell it to play the animation again. Notice that I have a second animation here. I've named a frame over here in my frame and my labels layer. I've named that frame walk. So if I tell it to go to and play walk, it'll come to this frame and it will play the walk animation, which is more of a hopping action, but it's fine. When it comes to the end of this animation, it'll go back to frame 1 and it'll stop again. Let's go over how to make this girl so that we can add her to our game. Let's make a new one. Let's make a new player. So I've downloaded this kidsicons.flaw from FlashKit, and it has some icons here. And I'll go ahead and I'll copy him, Control C. And let me make a new flaw file, so new ActionScript 3.0 file. Default size is fine. And I'm going to paste him there. And I'm going to use my free transform tool here to straighten him out so he's not standing sideways. Alright, so now let's go over the steps how to make an animated character. First thing I want to do is I want to change him to a movie clip. So I'm going to right click him, or you can press the F8 key if you are not on a Mac, and go ahead and say convert to symbol. And we can name him, what should we name him? We can name him Guy. And we can say OK. And now here's our Guy object. We're going to double click on him and notice that we're editing the Guy object. I can see it up here in the top left hand corner. And now I'd like to animate his arm. I'll show you how you can animate his arm. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, Control+. And I'm going to break him apart at first. So notice that he's a graphic, but he's all one graphic. And I'm going to do a Control B or Command B on a Mac. And I broke him apart, and you can see that he's broken apart because now he's a whole bunch of little dots or pixels. I'll click off of him, and I'll click just on the brown part of him. You notice it selects all of the brown part of him, and I'd only like to select his arm. So if that happens, I can use my lasso tool here. And I can take my lasso tool and I can lasso or select just his arm. Okay, I have just his arm. And I'm going to go ahead and Control G or Command G and group that together. So now his arm is an object. I want his arm to be animated, so it needs to be a movie clip object. So I'm going to right click, say Convert to Symbol, or press F8, Convert to Symbol. And I will call it arm left. So then it's his left arm. Oh wait, that's his right arm. So we'll name it right. Alright, so now I'd like to animate this thing. Let's set up our timeline. So in our timeline, we're going to have an actions layer. We're going to have a labels layer so that we're able to call it in our code correctly. We'll have the guy layer where his self is going to be. And then we'll have his arm layer. And this is his arm, right. Okay, so I'll click on that arm. Notice the arm is on the actions layer. So I'll Control X or Command X and cut that arm. Go to my arm layer and paste it. Command V. Now if it pastes behind him, I might have to click on my guy. Oops. Remember, Control Z is undo. There's my arm. So sometimes the arm might appear behind our player object, and if that happens, just use your tool here to not see the rest of him so that I could just select his arm. So Control plus is zoom in. So now his arm is on his own layer. And I'll just leave his arm right there for now. And I'll go ahead and select the rest of him by clicking and dragging and selecting the rest of my character here. And I can Control X or cut him and put him on the guy layer. I might have to readjust where he was. All right. So let's animate his arm now. So his arm should go right about here, and I can use my arrow keys to line it up correctly. I'm going to go ahead and right-click on his arm and tell it to create a motion tween. Notice it created the motion tween for me to 24 frames a second, which is 1 second. The rest of the frames didn't extend that far, and that's why it looks like he disappeared. So I'm going to right-click on that last frame and say Insert Keyframe. Insert Keyframe All. And right about the middle. Now I'd like to see the rest of my guy. So I'm going to click on his layer, and I'm going to right-click and just say Insert Frames. So then he is there, the whole 24 frames. I can do the same thing for my labels layer. Right-click and say Insert Frame. Right-click on my actions layer and say Insert Frame. Now notice I put a keyframe at the end here before I did anything else, and I did that so his arm will end up in the same position that it started, so it won't jump when it goes back to frame 1. And right about the middle of my tween is where I'm going to take my free transform tool, and I'll take his pivot area, which is this white dot, and I'm going to click on that white dot and move that white dot to where I'd like it to pivot. So I'd like his arm to pivot about his shoulder area. So move that white dot to his shoulder area so that when I rotate it, it'll rotate around this dot. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take his arm and move it downward. You might have to back it up a little bit to look more realistic so that I can see that his arm now waves. Now I need to add some actions to my actions layer to tell it not to wave until I tell it to. So in the first frame of your actions layer, go to your actions panel and write an action of stop. And then in your labels layer, you'd like the second frame here to have a name so that you can tell it to go to and play from that frame. I'll go ahead and right click and say insert keyframe. It needs to be a keyframe in order to receive a label. When I'm clicked on that frame, I'll go over to its properties. I know I'm on the frame because it'll say frame here. And I'll name that frame his action, which is to wave. So every time I want him to wave, I'll say go to and play wave. It'll play this animation. Go back to frame 1 and stop. Alright, he's looking pretty good. So I'll go back to scene 1 here. And I can take him now. So I will go ahead and click on him, and I will do a Command C or Control C if you're on a PC. Go over to your avoidergame.flaw file, paste him in there, and there he is. Notice if I double click on him, there's all of his animation. Alright, so I'd like him to be the player object, so this player object needs to go away. So I can either delete this player object or right click on him and go to properties and keep him as my player 2 backup object. So I'll add a 2 to his name. Notice I added 2 to his name and to his class name. You always want the name of your object to match the class name. Press OK. I can go over to my guy object now, and I can right click him. I'll go to his properties, and I can name him player now. I'll export for ActionScript and press OK. Now I'll delete his instance from the stage. Oh, I need to make sure that it says AS linkage to player. So I'll right click, go to properties, make sure this is our player class. Now I can delete that instance from my stage, and my player is over here on the right in my library. So now when I go to play my game, I can see that he is now my object, my player object. When I want him to wave, which we might want to happen every once in a while, we can write that in our logic in our code. So let's write some logic in our code to get him to wave. So we're going to add an event listener, which is important anyway. We need to add an event listener. And we're going to add an event listener for our enter frame event. And so now every time we enter a frame, so 24 times a second, we're going to call this function on frame enter. On the frame enter function, we wrote this function here. It says public function on frame enter. Whenever you have a function that is executed with an event, that function has to have a parameter of type event. So that's why we see this parameter here of type event. And our return type for our function is void. Inside of this function, we have player.goTo and play our wave, which tells it our code to go to the player object, go to his timeline, go to that wave frame, that frame we called wave, and play. So it'll go to the frame called wave and it'll play to the end and then go back to frame 1 and stop. So we can save this file and we can run him. And the reason that he's not waving is he is continuously waving, and he's continuously going to frame 2 and waving. And when you continuously go to frame 2, you can't see the wave because it doesn't play the whole timeline. So we need to get it to slow down. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to add a variable to our code called a counter. So we'll say private var counter. We'll make him of type number. We'll declare him up here with our instance variables. And then down in our constructor, we'll initialize counter to be 0. Now inside of this onFrameEnter function, we'll check and see if counter equals 0. Then we'll go ahead and we'll play our wave animation. And we'll increase counter by 1. So that way he won't equal 0 anymore, and that if statement will now be false. Now we're going to put an else part in our if statement, and we're going to keep on increasing counter. So counter is going to keep a count and start adding 1 to himself. Every time he doesn't equal 0, he'll add 1 to himself. And then we'll have another if statement here, and we'll say if counter, let's say, is greater than, let's say, 500, then we'll set counter back to 0. So that way he can get back into this if statement and play his wave again. So he'll play his wave, he'll count to 500, and then he'll play his wave, and then he'll count to 500. So he'll be waving every 500 counts or every 500 frames. So I'll go ahead and save that. You can see that he waves. He waits a count of 500, and then he'll wave again. Now instead of putting that 500 there, you can replace that 500 with a random number. So that way he doesn't have to wait every 500 frames a second, or 500 frames. There he waves again. If I used a math.random, let's say replace this with math.random. Now math.random returns a number between 0 and 1. So if I wanted it to happen periodically every 300 frames, I could use math.random times 300. Okay, 300 was probably too soon. Actually, math times 300, it was a number between 0 and 300, which is too short of time. So I'll say math.random, let's say times 100 plus 300, so that way it has to happen after 300. So he'll wait at least 300 frames plus another 0 to 100 random frames. So he's waiting between 300 and 400 frames and then waving again. You can play around with these numbers to get him to wave how many times you want him to wave. Now if I wanted my character to have more than just a wave animation, I could go over to my character object and I could animate him even more. Such as, here's my guy object at the moment. I could add a new frame label here, so I could right click and insert a keyframe and call it my walk. I could then add another keyframe at the end of my wave animation. I would insert a keyframe on my actions layer, and on my actions layer at the end of my wave animation, I would tell it to go to and stop on frame 1, so that way it will not just go to my walk animation. And then I'd like to add some frames here to my guy layer. so that he will appear along the entire animation. Now if I'd like to animate, let's say, his legs, I'd have to take his legs like I did before and cut them out. So I can zoom in on my guy object and use my shift key to select his legs. Select all parts of his legs here. And I could do a Command X. And I can make a new layer and call it leg right. Oops. Make sure you're labeling this guy leg underscore right. And on that leg layer is where I'll Control V or paste my leg. And I need this part to be part of my leg too, so I'll Command X that part. Go to my leg layer and Command V and paste that part. Use my arrow keys. I can even lock all the layers and only play around with my leg layer here. So I do Command A and I'll do a Control G and group that into a leg. And now since I want to animate that leg, I'll right click him and I'll say convert to symbol, or you can press F8. And this will be my leg on the right. Now I can put him back to where he needs to go. I'll go back to frame 1 here. Actually, I'll go back to frame 25 here, and I'll click on that leg and I'll say create motion tween. I want him to start here on frame 25, so I'll right click and say insert keyframe. All. Because I want his leg to start out at that position. I want his leg to end up at that position, so at the very last frame before I animate anything, I'm going to right click, say insert keyframe all. And now in the middle of that animation, so here's where he starts, here's where he's going to stop. I'm going to go ahead and hit my free transform tool and change my pivot area to be right about here. And I can take that leg and I can animate it up. Maybe move it up a little bit. And I can see that it does animate now. It does go up and down. Now if I want that leg to be behind my character so that you can't see it kind of moving up above his shirt, I could take that layer then and move it down here at the bottom. So that way when he animates, you can see that it's behind his shirt. Now notice his arm disappeared. His arm disappears because his arm is on this layer here and that layers have stopped. So I need to go to the end here and I can right click and I can say insert frame. So that way his arm doesn't disappear. So now when I tell it to go to and play, I'm going to go ahead and insert some frames on my labels layer, and I'm going to go ahead and insert some frames on my actions layer just so they'll extend. When I tell it to go to and play from walk, it'll go to this walk and it will play his left leg animation. Now I want to go ahead and do the same thing to his left leg, but I'll let you guys do that on your own. And now of course, when I want this new character to be inside of my file, here's my guy. I will copy him. I will come over to my avoider game.fly. Here's my other player. I'll right click on him and say properties. Name him player 3 now so that I could add my new player to my class and have him be the player. I'll go back to scene 1 here and paste him. So here's my guy. And then I'll right click on my guy, go to his properties, and name him player now. Export for ActionScript, make sure this says player. And now I have access to that walk animation. So just to make sure that that walk animation works, instead of going to and playing wave, let's go ahead and play walk animation. And I'll go ahead and run him, and you can see that his leg did move.